Hey guys, this is Tudor from Legion X Studios here with a brand new tutorial on how to shoot the perfect sunrise and sunset photo, and also obviously going into your post-processing and editing that bad boy. Now I have to say the trick with sunset and sunrise photos is really getting it right the first time in your camera to make your life easier when you actually get to the post-processing part inside of Lightroom or Camera Raw or even Photoshop, whatever you choose to work with. Getting it right in camera is super important. So for that reason, I want to kind of discuss a little bit about the approach of how to plan your shot out on the field and what kind of settings you should be using, and then obviously we'll jump into the more technical part of the actual color correcting and grading and everything inside of Lightroom and Camera Raw. So to get started, this tutorial is probably a little bit more geared towards some of the more higher end cameras. Reason being is because part of the methodology behind the way that I shoot sunrise and sunset photos, you really need to have a lot of shadow recovery capabilities in your camera, and sometimes that's best suited for cameras such as like the Canon 5D series, the 1DX, you got your Nikon D750s, the D800s, D810, now the D850 that's coming out, and you got Sony that's got the A7 II, the A7R II, some of those cameras, but you could probably push the boundaries with a lot of other cameras like the Canon 6D, the 6D Mark II, you got the Nikon D500, which is really great in low light. You could probably push it with a lot of them. It's not totally exclusive to some of the more higher-end cameras, but it definitely makes your life easier. The number one most important thing in shooting these sunrise and sunset photos, I find it is best to go out within the last hour, right before sunset. So obviously every day I go shoot, I check to see what time is the sunset at. And I always try to give myself a window of opportunity for the last 15 minutes before the sun is supposed to set. That is going to be your most beautiful color that you're going to get. But even the stuff leading up to those last 15 minutes can be great. Being in the right location, if you have something in the foreground that is very interesting and maybe the sun will set behind the skyline and you have a bunch of buildings, and obviously at that point the sun is going to be behind those buildings much earlier than those 15 minutes before sunset. So obviously you need to adjust based on your location when it's going to be best for you to shoot. But typically in my case, it's always around the last hour of the sunset, and the last 15 minutes is usually some of my best content that I am able to get. And sometimes after sunset as well. You can still get some really great stuff in the summer when the glow is so powerful, even though it's set behind the horizon. If you got some nice clouds in the sky, it really pops up the clouds from behind, and it gives you some really nice color in the sky. Let's get straight into the camera, kind of show you some of the settings and explain a few of the things of why I choose certain settings. Let's jump right into that. So here I have my camera, and I wanted to quickly kind of go over some of the settings that I would use for a typical sunset or sunrise photo. My starting point is always starting with my aperture, and my aperture is always at around an f4 or higher, and that is because 3 reasons. The narrower the aperture, the sharper the image tends to be. There's a fall-off point somewhere around f8, f9 on most lenses. Reason number 2 is because a higher f-stop will give us better results in our sun flares. So a lot of people like having nice sunbursts in their images. And then the third reason is it generally just gives better color, richer yellows and oranges in the sunsets and sunrises. Now that I have my kind of starting point of an f4, I would next look at my shutter speed. Now with my shutter speed, I always keep it above at least 1/200th or 1/250th of a second. The reason I never go below that is to make sure that my image is completely still and there's absolutely no shake, resulting in the highest quality image. Now, however, if you're at an aperture like f4, generally speaking, at that time of day when you're getting a lot of light from the sunset or sunrise, your shutter speed realistically is probably much higher. It's around 1/800th of a second or 1/1000th of a second. It really depends on how much available light you have. And the next thing that I look at is my ISO. Generally speaking, ISO values between 100 to 400 is where your camera performs best. And as I mentioned earlier, that we want to be able to recover as many details from our shadows as possible, where the image would be slightly underexposed. And the shadow recovery with most cameras performs best at these values of 100 to 400 ISO. And I'm actually going to include a link in the description where you can actually find out what these optimal ISO values for your own camera are on the DxOMark website. And I found that between 100 to 400 is best for my camera in general. So let's jump in now onto the computer and get started on the edit. So now that we've jumped onto the computer, we're going to get started here with a great edit. And this is a somewhat recent shot that I took probably I'd say like 2-3 months ago. So this shot was taken at Polson Pier in Toronto, where you can see the Toronto skyline, very beautiful, and a great sunset really. We had some great clouds, some interesting subjects in the foreground, with the seagulls flying around. And we actually got really lucky. There was some little girls, I think it might be these girls right here, that were feeding the seagulls, and that's what attracted them here, and it actually added so much more to the image. This is the final image that we have right here, and let's take a look at the kind of before and after. So you get the idea of, you know, there's been quite a bit of post-processing to this image. Now, one of the things I forgot to mention a little earlier, something very important about how to shoot in camera, trying to properly expose specifically for the sky. And the problem with most modern cameras is that they're great at recovering details in the shadows, but they're not so great at recovering details in the clouds. Or sorry, not the clouds specifically, but in the highlights. Now, this image does a pretty good job. You can see quite a lot of details are still, you know, seen in the clouds. But if I were to go back, I would probably underexpose this image a little bit more. And this image was taken at an f4, and I probably would have done that by pumping up aperture to maybe, you know, an f5.6 and f7.1, f8 or f9. Any of those probably would have given me the exposure in the sky that I was looking for. But in this case, you know, it's fine the way that it is, because we can do a lot of the manipulation here in Camera Raw. You can use Camera Raw or Lightroom for this. They're both the exact same program, more or less. So I guess let's get right into it and see how we got this bad boys off the ground. For this tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through virtually everything that is available inside of Camera Raw or Lightroom. We'll probably get our fingers on every single slider available to make that final image come to life from this original image. So our workflow is, you know, directly from top to bottom, you know, going through one panel at a time, making my adjustments that I need, and it just makes things easier to remember, you know, what do you need to do next. So obviously the first thing that I'm going to be doing is working with my exposure and making sure that I have the right exposure for the sky. And in this case, for this image, I brought it down by half a stop, negative 0.5, because I just wanted a little bit more details in the clouds, and we're going to be getting a lot of more details back through some of the other sliders, so we'll get to that in just a second. The next thing that we do is we bump up the contrast. This is pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure all of you have played with contrast, but it just, you know, obviously helps the image pop a lot more. Following by highlights. Highlights and shadows are both really great tools. And what they allow us to do is it allows us to really control the darkest and lightest portions of our image to bring back details. So, you know, one of them is recovering highlights, the other one's recovering shadows. So in this case, with most of my sunset photos, I'm always looking to recover details in both. Some people might like overexposing their sky, making this kind of ethereal looking sunset. That, however, is not my style, but in the case that you are looking to do something like that, maybe you're looking to increase your highlights. It really depends on your style and the style that you're trying to create for your photography. But in my case, this is kind of what I go for every single time. So for the highlights for this image, it was brought down to about -90, and you can really start to see all of that detail come back into the image, and it's really starting to look a lot greater. Now, the reason I only bring it to a -90, you know, some people might say like, oh, why don't you bring it to down to all 100? And you can, but it really depends on your image. Sometimes maybe you don't want that much light to be gone, but other times, depending on the image, it actually makes it look really bad. You get these really nasty ghosting effects, and there's other things that might be happening. So you never really want to push any of the sliders all the way to the maximum, because you don't know what you're going to expect. But obviously, you know, test it around, see what you get, and if you like the outcome, you're going to like it. It's, you know, it's your picture after all. Not, you know, you're not trying to please anybody else. Now, obviously, after that, we're looking at shadows, and with shadows, usually it's the exact polar opposite, and, you know, bring that up to 90, and we get a lot of that detail back into the image. Now, I do have to warn you, when you're playing with shadows, bringing back too much shadows sometimes makes your image look really flat, because it takes away a lot from the shadows, so that eliminates some of your contrast. Now, this right now doesn't look all too bad, but we're going to be adding a lot more contrast back in with some of the other tools as we go along. So now we are going to move on to clarity. We're going to skip white and blacks, but these function in a very similar way to how highlights and shadows work. However, they're not quite exactly the same. These are more color absolutes, so it doesn't really respect, how do I phrase this? It doesn't really respect a gradient. So with the sliders and the highlight shadows, it knows the hotspots. These are just the colors in general. So when I bump this up, it's just like it kills all the blacks all over the image. Whereas with shadows, it kind of only affects the image in the darkmost corners. So let's bring that back up to 90. So for this image, sometimes I use these, sometimes I don't. In this case, I did not, because I did not look like the outcome of the image. So moving on to clarity. Clarity is a very powerful feature, but must not be misused. You know, you have some amateur editors that will pump up the clarity all the way to 100, and you get this really kind of nasty HDR look. In some cases, you know, it might look nice, but most seasoned editors, let's put it that way, or seasoned photographers, would probably never go to an extreme like this. And some will actually even go in the negatives to add softness to the image, especially in portrait photography. In landscape, you probably want detail, but in portrait photography, you really don't want to accentuate too much detail in a person's face, because you obviously, you know, showing all those imperfections. So for me, really, I never go to anything higher than about 20. I feel like this brings enough punch to the image, and the clarity tool also gives you a little bit of contrast back into your image as well. So moving on to vibrance and saturation, I don't think I ever boost these. I always take away, and the reason being is that I'm adding colors through some of the other tools found inside of Camera Raw or Lightroom, whichever one you're using. And I really feel that when I take away from these ones, I'm much more flexible in adjusting images on a per color basis, rather than just, you know, bringing in too much vibrance and saturation into the entire color spectrum, because I don't want the image to have many different colors. It's there often is a very common theme of two very strong tones in my images, and if I'm giving more intensity to all the colors, that tonality of the two tones kind of disappears. So, you know, I don't ever go too crazy with these, but somewhere around -10 is usually good enough to be able to achieve the desired look that I'm going for. So moving on, we got our tone curve, and with my tone curve, generally it's always just a standard S curve, which many people are probably familiar with in color correction, especially if you've done video or anything else. Very standard procedure. And I always bump up the blacks to give that faded, moody look. I don't go too crazy, you know, I don't definitely never do this, because this looks like complete ass, but just a little bit really helps to give that moody look. So, you know, let's move on after that. Sharpening, again, a very powerful tool. probably would not use it in portrait photography very heavily, but in landscape photos, it works quite well. And in this picture, I really wanted it to pop, so I went pretty high, around 110. Now, with most images, if you sharpen too heavily, you're gonna start seeing some really nasty things, especially if your picture has a lot of grain. Sharpness is going to make your grain pop out that much more. So to be able to control this, there's a very powerful tool, the masking slider right here. And the masking slider basically tells you, what will I actually sharpen in the image. And if you hold down the Alt button or the Option button on a Mac and move the slider, you will see this kind of mask, this black and white mask pop up to show you what is actually being sharpened in the image. Now, digital noise is usually out in the open and you don't really get digital noise around the edges. And the way that I place this is I always kind of place it to the point where I'm seeing the outline of enough things that I want sharpened to make the image pop, and I kind of leave it around there. So in this case, it's probably around 90 to 95 on the masking slider. And while the effect is subtle, it definitely looks a lot better with than without. And sometimes you might want to reduce noise with using these sliders, but generally the way that I shoot, I never really find myself to have any unfavorable noise. A little bit of noise is good, but I never have too much where I'm really finding myself using that tool too often. So moving on to HSL, which is your hue, saturation, and luminance. This is where I do a lot of my coloring, and quite a lot happened here, and I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible and give some explanations to why I did certain things. I was talking earlier about this kind of two-tone approach to my images, and you've probably noticed that those two tones are usually an orange, pink, and then we have blue, two kind of contrasting colors to help bring the image to life and to bring some sort of consistency into my work by using these kind of two tones. So to start, we're looking at our oranges, and we want to make the oranges more red rather than yellow. So we're going to bring that over to -15, and then our yellows, we're actually going to go and make all of these yellows into orange. Now right now it's looking a little bit pinkish, but don't worry, when we're finished we're gonna have the right color. Next we have our greens and our aquas, so we're gonna bump these up to 50 and 25. Now you're probably not gonna see too much going on here just yet, but trust me when I say that these are going to play a part soon enough. Now we're moving into our saturation. Again, we're going to be looking at our oranges and yellows. So here we bumped it up to +20, +25, blues and aquas now. And we brought these down to -30 and -30 in the saturation, just to make it look a little bit more flat. Because we're going to be adding some more blue later on. But one of the other reasons why I took some of it out is, if you probably noticed earlier, let's bring these back to normal, we're getting a lot of blues here in the whites and the soles of the shoe. So I want to try to make that look as natural as possible whenever I can. And because some of the later blue adjustments that we do, it's actually going to bring a little bit more blue in. So just trying to make it look clean. So moving on then, we're going to go over to luminance, and we're going to bring the aquas down by -40 and the blues by -50, and that's going to give us a lot darker colors. It looks a lot more punchy. And then we're going to move into probably one of my favorite parts about using Lightroom or Camera Raw, and this is the split toning tool. And this is really where it starts coming to life, where you're able to place in colors that probably weren't there to begin with, but when done tastefully, it can look really great. So there's two main sliders here. We have our highlights and our shadows, and they're pretty self-explanatory. Whatever color you add in your highlights, you're going to have apply to the lightest portions of the image, and then the shadows is going to apply to the darker places in the image. And this really works great for the sunset and sunrise photos, because you have the warm colors in the highlights, and then the cold colors in the shadows. So because skies landscape images are usually kind of like a 60-40 split between foreground and sky, I start off with my balance, and I kind of put this more heavily skewed towards the shadows, because there's going to be a lot more shadow elements to the images than there are going to be highlights. So obviously that's going to be the most predominant color in the picture. If it were to be the other way around, then I probably would be doing it the other way around. But in this case, it's kind of the explanation to why I do it this way. So the balance I bring down to -50 in this case. We can start with the highlights. So the highlights, we have a warm hue of 30, which is this nice kind of brown orange color, and then we bring up the saturation to around 40 right here, so give us a nice little orange glow to the entire image. But we're going to offset that a little bit by adding some shadow colors in the shadows. So we're going to go to the hue number of 225, which is a nice blue, and just add in a little bit of blue to the image to offset some of the darker areas of the image, like that, with just the saturation of 15, not too crazy. So we're getting a lot closer to our original edit of the image, or we're pretty close. I would say the exposure and everything is looking great. It's just some of the colors are not quite there just yet, but we're getting close. So let's move on to our lens correction. So generally I don't use any of these profile lens correction. Chromatic aberration I usually don't get with landscape photos, because I'm shooting at f4 and above, and most lenses will not have issues at those apertures. It's usually only when you're wide open at like f1.8, f1.4, 2.8 sometimes, depending on the lens. And profile correction I think looks awful. And I'll show you the example right here where I feel like it flattens the image. Sure, you get a nice exposure around the image, you get rid of that vignetting that is happening, but I think it makes the image look too flat. I kind of like this, you kind of almost get like a warping effect that gives it life. But I do sometimes make adjustments here manually, and I'll add some vignetting of +20 to offset some of that vignetting that we're getting in the image without removing the warping of the image. And by doing this, it doesn't look as flat, in my opinion at least. Sometimes I'll go over here into the transformation tools as well, and if the image is not perfectly straight, sometimes I'll transform options, and this is probably the best one to use, is just the automatic right transformation, which generally speaking will probably make your horizon pretty straight. If you feel like that's failing, you can try some of the other ones. You could rotate it manually, or you could use the ruler tool right here, where you can just draw where the straight line is supposed to be, and the image will rotate and crop perfectly so that the horizon is straight. Obviously a very important part of the process. Moving on, effects, I don't use any of these, at least not for this image. And then we're at the last part of the image, the last hurrah to give it that nice punch and color that, you know, I've grown to love in my images. And this is a camera calibration, and what the camera calibration does is it affects the original colors from camera, so kind of like the base colors that come together to give the images. It's probably the best explanation that I can give you. So if you affect these, it drastically changes how your image looks, and you don't want to go overboard ever with these things, because you can really get some really nasty looking images that just look so fake and they're not pleasing to the eye at all. So in the case of this picture, so I set the hue for the red primary to a +50, so this brings the red colors more towards an orange rather than this pink look. So you can see it, if we just go back for a second, it really makes this orange pop in the sky, and I think it affected the water a little bit as well, but not too much. Now we move on to our greens and bump that up to 90, so that suppresses a little bit of the orange, because when we're going to be changing the blues, that's also going to affect the oranges as well. There's an interesting kind of triangle relationship between these two, and when you play with one, you might need to play with the other two as well to kind of hold that relationship true to itself. And then we have the blues, where we're going to change the hue to -85.
And the saturation values, in most cases, I try not to play around with them too much because I feel like it really makes the image look really fake, and it just like the colors are not realistic anymore. Sometimes, if anything, I might take away a bit of saturation, so you can see probably, you know, maybe like a -10 over here, just so, you know, again, these soles of the shoes don't look too bad. And this is basically it. Pretty close to the original right here. Maybe this one's a little bit darker here, but I'd say a pretty good reproduction of the original image. So if you guys have any questions, you know, drop them in the comments below. You know, leave a like, subscribe if you enjoyed this tutorial. I'm sorry this was a little bit long, but I really wanted to go into detail and really explain what's going on here for all of you to learn more of a process than a step-by-step tutorial to copy what I've done. I really want you guys to understand, you know, what goes on behind the camera, you know, with the camera settings, and understanding why changing certain things will allow you to achieve certain results, and, you know, kind of what each of these sliders actually do, and, you know, how it helps you plan a little bit better. So stay tuned for the next tutorial, and you know, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and take care till next time.